how this is going to jump rails a little bit.
Okay.
But this is one of the questions that popped up because we keep having this conversation come before us, either from people that I'm ministering to or talking to, people you're ministering to, talking to. How do couples in ministry make it work?
Wow. Here's the deal. I'm gonna use Jesus's words, and the two shall become one. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
One flesh.
Yeah.
So when we talk about you're in ministry, actually, if you and Gina are one, then you and Gina are in ministry.
That's right.
You know what I mean? If I'm in ministry, then Lori and I are one. Lori and I are in ministry. And it's the same thing. What I find is that people need to understand that God doesn't call an individual. If you're married, He calls the couple. And it is. And it doesn't mean we have to have this exact same function. We just have to have the same heart.
Yeah.
And that heart is that we're going to do something to take the gospel forward. So a lot of times it's being able, really, it's the communication. It's, with little theology. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go. Ephesians 5. We quote verse 22, a lot, wives, submit yourself to your husband as under the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife. And back in my grandfather's day, that was used to beat women up and make them subservient.
Yeah.
And because we had a misunderstanding, and we saw the scripture through a Western culture. The challenge is, Jonathan, there wasn't a Western culture when the scriptures were written, so we probably ought to reevaluate that.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Stop.
So in the midst of that, what had to happen was we had to understand, what did that say? So before we quote verse 22, let's go back to verse 21.
Yeah.
Okay. Verse 21, Ephesians 5, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of the Lord. Verse 22, wives, submit yourself to your husband as under the Lord. So let's look at those two things. They're taken from the same root. The word submit there is hupotasso. It's the Greek root for that word, submit. The reference point in verse 21, submitting yourself one to another, literally means to honor and prefer. Okay? So we're going to say this. I'm going to use Lori, my wife. My goal, submitting yourselves one to another. I'm honoring and preferring her. What does that mean? My goal is to lift her up, to strengthen her, to lift her to the highest and best possible place.
Right.
And if I honor and prefer her, but she's also honoring and preferring me, what's that saying? She's looking at me saying, how can I lift you up? How can I encourage you? How can I help you to become everything God created you to be?
Wow.
Right? So now we're honoring and preferring one another, right?
Yeah.
That's how we can do ministry together.
Wow.
Because we're lifting each other up to the place. This is what God created you for. And I want to help you become everything God created you to be. You know what I mean? So my goal in life is not to see my dreams fulfilled. Maybe my biggest goal in life is to help her fulfill her dreams. Why? We're honoring and preferring. Now it says, wives, submit to your husband. What that literally means, the word submit there, is to come under the covering. The Greek has word pictures. It's the covering, like an umbrella. You're coming under the umbrella. And that's a huge thing. I love to teach that stuff. But she'll come underneath that umbrella as long as she knows she's secure, because her greatest need in life, because every woman's greatest need, 100 psychologists in a room, put them all in a room, ask them anything. They're not going to agree on hardly anything, but they would agree every woman's greatest need can be boiled down to one word, and that word is security.
Wow.
She wants to know that she's secure, okay? If she comes under my covering and my covering is complete, she's secure. I believe I need to cover her physically, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. And as long as I have her covered, she feels secure. She'll come under that covering. If there's a hole in any area of that umbrella, then she doesn't feel secure. She puts up her own umbrella because she wants to make sure that she's covered.
Right.
And then that's when we have umbrella bump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about marriages just for a second,
Sure.
this is something that I want to go, maybe we're still in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
What happens? We hear this a lot. Both you and I have talked about hearing this a lot.
Yeah.
The husband is called to ministry. The wife doesn't feel like she's called to do what the husband's doing or at the pace that the husband is doing it. And maybe the wife says, I'm okay with you being in ministry, but I'm not called to do that because I don't want to look like the pastor's wives that I've seen.
Yeah.
And they get their archetype for identity from what they've seen previously, not what they could be presently or in the future. How do we help wives who don't, I may say this wrong, who don't feel equally yoked, even though they really are, but they don't feel like the output of their ministry is the same, whether it be pace or call, as the husband? How do we help them?
Yeah, super good. So let's go back again, because I'm a word guy. We're going to go back to the word, and we'll come back and let's revisit verse 21.
Sure.
Okay. Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of the Lord, honoring and preferring. So this all starts out by having a conversation, but a real genuine, heartfelt. This isn't high decibel. This is sitting we're sitting right here, cup of coffee, whatever. Okay, so if you're the wife and I'm the husband, you don't feel that call. You need to trim. Okay.
Can I be the husband? I'm just saying, let me be the husband.
Yeah, let me get, okay. But then I'd have to, no, okay. But in that, what I want you to understand is this, is that in that place, if you don't feel the same calling, that's absolutely fine. Okay. What are you called to? Right. And my place as the husband, then, as the spiritual head in the family, I'd be looking at, okay, what do you feel like God's created you for? What do you feel like the call of God on your life? Because none of us are called to sit in a pew. Right. Everybody has something to contribute.
Right.
Okay. So what do you feel called to? What, and I don't know what I feel called to. Maybe that's your response. Okay. What energizes you? I believe that when we're doing what God called us to do, it'll be gaining. And if we're doing something God didn't call us to do, it will be draining.
Right.
Okay. When I'm flowing in the anointing of what God called or created me to do, I find that, man, everything inside of me comes alive. Everything inside of me is building. You know what I mean? So in that place, what I'm looking at is, how does this play out in the big picture of, I'm going to help you. I'm going to encourage you to become everything God created you to be. I can't help you to become everything God created you to be if you can't tell me what God created you to be. What energizes you?
Right.
What fulfills you? What do you find the most fulfillment in? Now, how can I help you in that area as I'm doing in mine? And I don't want to leave you behind in the dust, because I've watched that play out, and that usually ends tragically.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So at the end of the day, wives don't have to look exactly like their husbands in their output.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And not only that, they don't have to have that archetype that you talked about. You know, what we saw in 1985, we might not see in 2025 at all. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. And thank God.
What about when the wife feels like she's called? Because this is, I've dealt with this as well, just in the last month, probably 3 couples. The wife is like, and they don't mean it this way. They tend to come in desperation. They're saying, I love him so much and I love God so much, but without saying it directly, they're saying he doesn't love God like I love God.
Yeah.
And until he meets my standard, I don't feel safe under the umbrella to submit to what's going on, because, and this is typically what happens when a wife does feel closer to the Lord. It's not like they're not powerful. They're not called. They have all the same access to Holy Spirit that the husband does. But that, how do we help men, firstly, not be offended by wives who want better for them?
Yeah.
And how do we help women understand that just because they're passionate about the things of God, because it's a two-way street, right? We all have our faults that we bring to be worked on, together. But how do we help wives in that situation not grow weary in their well-doing and to not become bitter or judgmental toward the husband?
One of the things we have to understand, Jonathan, is that sometimes even like this, and I've watched this play out lots of times.
Yeah.
First of all, just because a man's not hyper emotional doesn't mean he's not connected to God.
Right.
Sometimes in a service, there'll be a person sitting there and they're like, it doesn't look like there's a lot going on.
Right.
There may be a lot more going on in the guy who's sitting there quiet than in the person who's over here jumping.
Right.
Because we measure by the external when there might be a whole lot more going on internally that we don't realize.
Sure.
Because not everybody expresses passion in the same place. Okay. Now, the other side of that is, so let's say the woman feels this real drive to go after and chase the deep things of God, and the man's really just not quite there. And she needs to understand, again, this is 1 Corinthians 7. Even if he's an unbeliever, the unbelieving husband sanctified by the wife. What does that mean? As her continual pursuit of God, as long as she loves him well. You know what? He finds something inside of her. He was attracted to her for a reason, and it might just be that her pursuit of God, that Jesus inside of her was the thing that attracted him in the first place. You know what I mean? But she's got to continue. She doesn't quit pursuing God, but I think there's a place where she has to be able to pursue God in the place of, I'm doing this in a place where it looks like an invitation for you to come with me, rather than you stupid dog. You know what I mean? What's wrong with you? And why won't you chase Jesus? You're going to go straight to hell. You know what I mean? Because that never wins. You know what I mean? So she has to keep it to the place where can you make it attractive that he wants to come?
Sure.
That he's hungry for those things.
Yeah, there are many times where we do marriage counseling that I have to remind people, you're actually one now.
Yeah.
And if you could imagine somebody that's always beating themselves up, and I'll take them down a road of saying, this is Bob, and Bob is always down on himself, and he can't seem to get it right. How would you help Bob?
Yeah.
Well, I would tell him to quit being down on himself. Okay, you guys are married and you're one.
Yeah.
And you're being down on half of you.
Yeah.
And you're wondering why you can't get it together. Yeah. And so I know for men, and I'm not a woman, so it's difficult for me to fully comprehend what might help. Gina would be great in the seat, or Mama Lori would be great in the seat for that. Yeah. But I often tell women to champion their husbands into what they believe they can become by cheering them on and saying in prophesying the things, calling things that are not as though they were,
right,
and pushing them in that way as opposed to telling them what they're not. Most men know what they're not.
Thanks. Yeah.
And when we affirm what they're not, then we give them an excuse to live mediocre.
Right. One of the things that I talk about with them a lot is the idea, can you celebrate who he is without stumbling over who he's not?
That's a good word.
You know what I mean? And because people are attracted to what you celebrate. Yeah.
I love it. All right. Mm-hmm. There's a little excerpt in marriage. Mm-hmm. I want to switch again. When did you realize that you were now fathering? You've been in ministry a long time. I don't know, like 150 years.
Yeah.
And it feels like it sometimes, I'm sure, because I feel that way and I haven't been in ministry as long as you have. We're always kind of fathering. Right. If we're discipling, we're fathering. If we're doing it the right way.
Yeah.
You know, as long as we're not making machines or soldiers, we're ultimately fathering. But at what point in life did you become aware, oh my gosh, not only am I okay to father, I'm okay with that terminology.
Yeah. So I would tell you, we had, okay, let's go back. 1982, I'm a pastor.
The year I was born.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, but 1982, I'm pastoring. And truthfully, when God called me, and I would say probably that was 1980, that I really knew I could take you to the church I was at. It was a Sunday night. I knelt down at the altar one way, got up another way, and I knew the difference. God had given me a shepherd's heart. And I think that was probably, I knew God called me. I knew he did not call me to be an evangelist or a prophet or anything like that. It was a 100%, God gave me a shepherd's heart. And I knew that. And so did Lori, because she wasn't at the altar with me. She's at her seat. She's praying at her seat, tears crying. I'm up there. Bill Flick has his hands on me. I can still, this is a very defining moment in my life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in that time, I knew, okay, so I began to pursue ministry, understanding what it looks like to be a pastor. 2 years later, I am now pastoring, probably totally clueless. That was my spiritual gift, cluelessness. I was flowing in my gift and trying to figure it out. But I knew that God had given me an increased capacity to love people. So I'm the happiest pastor on the planet. I love what I do. I'm doing this for years. Start Harvest Chapel, 1997. Super happy. And language is beginning to shift. And I hear this, father thing, and I'm like, well, call no man father.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I'm like, okay. And for me, because I was raised Catholic, I didn't want you to call me father. Which is a
completely different spin on
different terminology. Yeah. So in the midst of all that, then people start, again, prior to those years, you didn't hear a lot about apostle, prophet, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff. We heard the words prophet, not a whole lot of apostle phrases, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then people start using that term, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I'm not into labels, I'm into function. None of this stuff matters anyway, you know?
Right.
Rick Rivera, who's been one of my best friends for years, and was at one point the associate pastor with me before he went to work for Todd. Now he's back with us, but super, super, just wonderful guy. Love Rick. And he said something to me that probably marked my life. I've used it hundreds of times since then. He said, there's something that's complete in life when you have a Paul, a Silas, and a Timothy. And I said, okay, help me. He said, a Paul is somebody who's pouring into you. A Silas is somebody that you can run with and do life with. And a Timothy is somebody that you're pouring into intentionally. And there's something about a completed circle, a Paul, a Silas, and a Timothy. And that really marked me. And I thought, yeah, that's a good word, man. And I started to understand that because there's people who would pour into me. There's people that like Rick that I could run with. And then there's people that I had the ability to pour into.
Right.
And I thought, it's fulfilling.
It is.
And I began to understand. And I knew that in my younger years, there was a couple guys that really touched my life and marked me. But I didn't have that person that I knew on that particular day. I had some pastor friends of mine that if I was in trouble or I had something that I was really, maybe not in trouble, but contemplating, or there was something I was trying to work through, there was a couple guys I knew I could call, but I saw them more as Silas's more than Paul's, if that's,
Right.
But I did know that I had some people that were Timothy's that I know when they're having difficulty or whatever, they look to me and they began to use phrases like, well, you're my spiritual father. And I'm still struggling with like, okay, I'm not sure that that's even a thing,
Right.
but I'm not worried about semantics. I'm worried about function. So back to that phrase. And I realized that as we went on, then they were using the term, you're a spiritual father. And I thought, that's just a good word for your pastor for a lot of years, and now you're old. Okay. Like you didn't quit. You're not dead.
Right. You're still chugging on.
And then what I began to understand, and here's probably when it became real to me, is when my dad died, my physical, biological dad died, and we're at the funeral home. There were people who were friends of his who came immediately to me and said, "You must be." My dad's name was Richard, but a lot of them called him Dick. They said, "You must be Dick's son, Don." And I said, "I am." And they said, "Yeah, I could pick you out across the room anywhere because you look just like your dad." Okay.
Yeah.
What they just said is you have the DNA of your father. Okay. Now, the main thing is that we have the DNA of this father, right?
Right.
But every church, every ministry has its own DNA. Is that okay to say that?
Sure.
Churches are language specific. Harvest Chapel had a language, like the School of Kingdom Living had, put that language out to a broad spectrum. There's a lot of different things like that. But we carry our own DNA, if that's the right thing. And I realized that I was reproducing in younger ministers the DNA of this house. Okay.
Right.
So what happened is that was spiritual fathering, whether I wanted to put that label on it or not was okay.
Right.
And I began to understand that and realize, okay, that's not a bad thing. You know what I mean? And we began to say, what does that mean to be a spiritual father? You're reproducing what God put in you.
Right.
Because fathers reproduce. Again, don't hear this the wrong way. Two people get married, right? He becomes a husband, not a father. When does he become a father?
When children are produced.
So he reproduces himself. Now he's a father. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
And people
it gives language to it. It helps conceptualize the whole thing, so it takes the weirdness out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's something about fathering that I think that you would even agree with. It's not only about reproducing himself, but it's reproducing people that look more like Christ.
Yeah.
It's saying, hey, these are the parts of your parts of your life that are incomplete that I have had to walk through, and I can spot it because I've walked through it.
Yeah.
And I know that I've gotten victory in these areas, and it's kind of giving away the steps, the keys, and discipling, stewarding, shepherding. We have all those different words, different semantics.
Sure.
But it's ultimately when we reproduce people that look more like Jesus than they did before we met them.
Yeah.
You ultimately become a father through the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what is Paul that says, like, I became a father to you in the gospel.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
good.
Again, Paul says we got a lot of teachers, but we don't have a lot of fathers.
Right.
Because the fathers aren't trying to reproduce. They're trying to, a teacher's trying to inform.
Right.
A father's trying to reproduce. So a teacher will inform you and keep going, but a father will stick with you and reproduce everything that God did in him and you.
Say that one more time. Teachers inform,
but fathers reproduce.
That's a fantastic word. I'm going to have to go back and watch this video now.